Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Drapers Connects. My name is Graham Moran, and I am the Associate Editor here at Drapers. Thank you all very much for joining us. Drapers Connects is our series of Q&A sessions, panel talks, and webinars just like this that aim to bring the fashion and retail industry together to discuss the biggest issues of the day. As well as our live webinar series, you can access an archive of all of our past webinar recordings online at drapersonline.com. Today, in partnership with Reconomy, we'll be discussing everything you need to know about extended producer responsibility and textiles. Thank you to our panel of experts that are joining us. I'm going to hand over to you each to give a quick introduction to yourselves. Sue, why don't we start with you?
Good afternoon, Graham. Thanks very much for inviting me. My name is Sue Fairley, so I head up the ESG team, sustainability team, the quality team and the sourcing team at New Look. So quite a nice big remit, but all things product and supplier facing. It's good to be here to talk about EPR. It's something which is very topical at the moment. It's something that we've been involved with quite a lot of groundwork preparation on. So yeah, it's great to be here to talk about it.
Good. Thank you, Sue. Now, Amy, over to you. Why don't you tell our audience a little about yourself and about Reconomy?
Thanks so much, Graham. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Campanella. I'm the Business Development Director for Textiles EPR. And my focus is all around the textile EPR legislation that is mostly coming out of Europe and is actually already established in 4 countries in the EU, but is happening globally. And I'm really excited to be here today and tell you more about EPR for textiles and how you can get ahead of this upcoming legislation.
Thank you, Amy. To our audience, if you are watching live, please, we encourage you to ask questions via the Zoom chat function, and we'll do our best to answer any relevant questions throughout or at the end. So let's get started. As Amy said, extended producer responsibility legislation for textiles is coming. For fashion brands and retailers, these impending laws represent a challenge, but also possibly an opportunity. What is it that fashion brands and retailers need to know about extended producer responsibility? And what should businesses be doing to prepare? Hopefully today we'll aim to answer those questions and more. So, Amy, what exactly is extended producer responsibility, otherwise known as EPR? So we'll refer to it as EPR now to save our words. And how exactly does it extend to textile?
Thanks for that first question, Graham. EPR is a policy approach that makes producers responsible for the entire life cycle of the products they place on the market. That's from design all the way to disposal. When it comes to textiles, it means fashion brands and retailers will be held accountable for what happens to their products after consumers are done with them. The idea is it's encouraging more sustainable design and recycling. And to give you a bit of background on EPR, it's actually been around since 1990. It first started in Sweden for packaging. And bring us up to present day, and we've got not only for packaging, but for batteries, and more increasingly textiles. But I mean, EPR even extends to some other countries to include fractions like chewing gum and sporting goods too.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, in the name itself, extended producer responsibility, it specifies producer. What I'm asking lots of what sound like simple questions, but I think is very interesting to start us off for some context. Who or what is a producer in the context of EPR?
A producer in the context of EPR is typically any company that manufactures, sells, imports, or distributes products within a market. In the textile sector, this would include fashion brands, retailers, importers, and even online e-commerce platforms too.
Okay. And again, another simple sounding question, but you mentioned how there are, EPR for packaging. Obviously, today we're talking about textiles. What are we classifying as textiles?
Textiles are generally going to include apparel, clothing, footwear, and household linens. Each country right now that has existing textile EPR legislation defines it slightly differently. And the idea behind the upcoming legislation coming out of the EU is to harmonize some of these differences between each of the countries that has that legislation, which includes France, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Latvia. Usually, textiles covers anything made from fibers or textiles intended for consumers.
Perfect. And you mentioned there, and you said in your introduction, a lot of this is coming out of the EU, so it's EU law. So how, not to mention the B word, but we're talking from the UK here, obviously post-Brexit. How will this affect UK businesses?
So although the upcoming legislation is coming out of the European Union, it's absolutely going to affect UK businesses that trade within the EU market. So any UK business that's placing on the market in the EU will need to comply with these upcoming regulations. And the UK is actually exploring its own EPR schemes too. So this is on the horizon for the UK market. And many fashion brands and retailers might already be familiar with textiles EPR if they place on the market in France. France has had legislation since 2008 for textiles EPR, with the Netherlands and Hungary starting most recently in 2023, and then Latvia as well as North Macedonia starting in 2024.
So what does this actually mean for brands and retailers? Like, what impact is this going to have on, day-to-day operations?
I'd say that what's going to be most significant is the financial impact. Producers, brands, fashion retailers, they're going to face fees based on the amount and type of textiles that are placed on the market. This is going to push companies to rethink their design, materials, and overall business models to be more sustainable.
And as you said, nothing is actually confirmed yet. Nothing is set in stone or set in law, to be more precise. But we know this is coming, and as you said, there are countries who are already ahead on this. Should brands and retailers be concerned? Should they be preparing now, or do you think it's best to wait and find out exactly what the rules are, what the amounts are? What's your advice around that?
So even though nothing is finalized, brands and retailers should definitely start caring now. Being proactive allows companies to adapt gradually, build internal systems, and avoid scrambling when the legislation takes effect. It also is going to position brands and retailers as leaders in sustainability, which can benefit their brand image. As far as a timeline for when we're anticipating the legislation to come out of the EU, well, to give you a bit of background on where we've progressed to date, back in March, members of the European Parliament pretty much voted unanimously in favor for textiles EPR. And we were anticipating that by the end of this year, textiles EPR would be placed in the Waste Framework Directive as an amendment. This may get postponed to the start of next year. We're not exactly sure, but that doesn't mean that business should delay. Start learning about what the legislation is in the current countries that have textile EPR. It's very likely that the EU legislation will mirror some of the scopes within the different areas of the legislation, like what types of products and the types of fees, and also data preparation. Start thinking about where sales data and product information is coming from and consolidate it. Understanding data and being able to forecast potential fees with that data to understand financial applications will be crucial to getting ahead of this.
You mentioned a key part of this is going to be that collection and ultimately reporting of data. What happens if brands don't or can't at this stage? They get caught out. What will happen?
So we would recommend not taking a risk-based approach because the consequences are fines and potentially reputational damage too. So if brands don't comply with reporting requirements, the fines that they could face could be not only for the current year, but could backdate to previous years of non-compliance as well. And I mean, the data collection process may seem like an administrative burden, but it really is such an essential step in moving towards a more transparent and sustainable fashion industry.
So, as we've covered, essentially EPR means that brands and retailers will be charged for the items that they make, and that money will be used to sort of take care of the products at the end of their useful life. But again, this isn't finalized yet, but if brands and retailers make products that are deemed better, which will be defined, but isn't quite yet, then the charges may be lower. So in that sense, you can sort of see this as an incentive to do better. That in a much easier term is called, I believe, eco-modulation. And I'm really interested to hear about this because I think this is where a lot of the innovation can happen. Amy, can you tell us a bit more about that and kind of how that might work and how we can see that as an incentive?
Yeah, absolutely. So eco-modulation is a fantastic approach that encourages brands and retailers to create more sustainable products. Essentially, it means that companies will be charged based on the environmental impact of their items. If they can produce products that meet certain sustainability criteria, like being recyclable, made from eco-friendly materials, or designed for longevity, they could face lower fees. This not only incentivizes innovation and better practices, but also drives the entire industry towards a more sustainable future. And right now, when it comes to textiles, the only current system that has eco-modulation is in France. Refashion, which is the producer responsibility organization in France, has a fantastic eco-modulation system where there's 3 different sets of criteria which can earn producers a reduction in their fees. And that is all around designing for durability, where an ISO certification helps to evidence that a product is durable. There's also up to 8 different environmental certificates that producers are able to work towards, such as fair trade, which helps to reduce fees. And finally, the 3rd criteria is all around incorporating recycled content, and the source of that recycled content being within a certain radius of France. And now, the other countries in the EU that have textiles EPR, as I've mentioned, the Netherlands, Hungary, Latvia, and North Macedonia, don't currently have any eco-modulation structure. And we're not too sure what it's going to look like in the EU. However, the draft legislation does state that there will be an eco-modulation system. So we can anticipate that it's likely there'll be a lot of inspiration taken from France, since that is currently the only system that's in place, and it's also well established.
Excellent, thank you. Sue, now I'm going to come to you. I know you'll have an opinion that we'll love to hear. So what are your views on EPR and textiles? Are you in favor of it? Do you think it's a good idea?
That's a very leading question. I think the answer to that has to be, I'm in favor of money being spent on increasing the circularity within our textiles business models. And if the way in which we're going to pay for that is through EPR, then yes, of course, we're in favor of it. New Look are taking a stance whereby we are preparing for it. We're accepting of it. I think that's the best word I would attach to it. We're advocating for eco-modulation because it's really important that we want to be part of a community that is reducing the impact of the way in which we do business. We want to be part of the conversation. I think that's really important. So Amy's outlined what's happening in Europe. New Look are already supplying to retailers in Europe. We're part of platforms with Zalando and ASOS, and therefore we're supporting, and we have to pay some of our own from our .com website. I think also people need to appreciate that the Republic of Ireland is also part of Europe. So actually it's much closer to home than just crossing the channel, basically. So I think the answer is, yeah, accepting, advocating, want to be part of the conversation, and want to direct and help in the decisions. I think the other thing I want to say is I want it to be fair. So that's really important, that actually that it's fairly gathered basically from retailers.
Excellent, thank you, Sue. You said New Look are preparing. What could you tell us some of the things that you've done up to this point that our audience might be interested to take away, and anything that you have coming up that you might not have actioned yet, but you're doing to be prepared for this? Because I think it is it's difficult when you don't know, but we kind of know, we have an idea, and obviously, as Amy said, being proactive, not reactive, is the best way to be. So yeah, anything you have around that for our audience?
I think that's the point, and I think actually the fact that we've had to gather data to pass on to partners has made us realise actually how we need to get the data into some kind of order for this. The first thing I would say is that most people that are listening to this call will have been party to requiring to report on waste, whether that be through the WEEE regulations or whether that be through the plastic packaging tax or other EPRs that are coming from a packaging perspective. So the theory is the same, basically. The bottom line is we're going to pay for some taxes, basically, which pay for the what happens to the product once it's come to the end of its usable life. So from our point of view, I think what I would say is that actually most retailers will be doing lots of things to look at the impact of their product. And I'm seeing this very much as a convergence now of actually being able to use data for multiple purposes. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is don't run scared on it, because actually the chances are that you're already starting to pull together data which is actually going to help from this perspective. From New Look's point of view, actually one of the biggest moves forwards for us was when we were applying for our science-based targets, and it actually got us to change the way we looked at the raw materials that were in the product, and also understanding the weight of the material. Quite a big difference, basically. At the moment, we tended to collect information based on the fibre composition of the various different components, but actually you start to look at, okay, what is the weight of the material, and what is the nature of the material that's in your product. We also, I would also advocate for everybody to really be aware of the industry bodies that are working on this. So being part of the collaboration that's working on this is also really key. So an example of that would be starting to work with the likes of Textiles 2030, some of the tools that they present, basically, and the RAP programme. We're part of the Circular Fashion Innovation Network. They're also advocating for being part of the conversation around EPR, and we took part in a sandbox project as part of the UKFT project, basically, with the NICER hub, and that involved actually a lot of the trade associations, so UKFT, the British Fashion Council, University of Exeter. And that was really important because it was about just providing data and helping them in a sandbox to identify whether or not the data was good enough to be able to link our sales to actual product data. So what was the nature and the type of the product that we'd sold? What was it made of? What weight was it? How much recycled content did it have? So I guess the first piece would be, is in preparing, it's basically trying to identify the data streams that are going to help us report accurately in the first place.
Great. Amy, we didn't prepare for this, but I just thought Sue made a very good point there, that this EPR is a slightly different approach in that it is going to focus on the weight of products rather than the what goes into making the products. Could you tell us a little bit about that, just so the audience is up to speed on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So referring back again to the French system, which I mentioned earlier, has been around since 2008. The EPR system there is based on units placed on the market. So however many actual products are sold onto the market, whether it's t-shirts or jeans or cotton jumper, that is where the fees apply. And the fees can vary, some as low as around 1 euro cent, going up as high as 12 euro cents per unit. And that depends on the product category, which there are quite a few, but generally it follows those rules, what type of item it is, and perhaps the gender and definitely the material. And then in the other countries in Europe that have existing legislation, the fees are based on a price per kilo. And those prices all vary slightly. In the Netherlands, I think right now it's around 10 euro cents, and it's going to be going up to around 20 euro cents. And again, this can vary depending on which producer responsibility organization is responsible for the fees, and we'll touch upon what a PRO is in a minute. And then we also have Latvia, which is between 15 and 50 euro cents, and then finally Hungary around 45 euro cents. And then the draft legislation in the EU, it states that it will follow a price per kilo fee structure. And although we don't know much more than that, looking at what the current fees are, we can kind of work out an average and see where we think this fee may lie. And I think this is why what Sue at New Look is doing is the right way to go. It's not only understanding where all of your product data is, the sales and the materials, but it's also understanding what the weight of these materials are too, and starting to prepare that data, anticipating that when the EU legislation comes, that's the fee structure that'll be there. Although saying that, it's very likely that there's many fashion brands and retailers and textile producers on this call that maybe sell into the Netherlands and Hungary, and perhaps need to start thinking about preparing their data now for reporting. I think the Netherlands reporting was due in just this past August, so it's likely that there's many producers on this call that are already becoming familiar with the weights of their products.
So was that, just out of interest, was that something that you did collect before, or is it new? No.
So I mean, most retailers will collect the weight of product if they're emailing it, not emailing, e-com sales, etc. But that's really about the cost of actually getting product to consumers. What we're talking about is actually identifying how much fibre there is and what the nature of the fibre is. So in the past, for example, we may have quoted a product as being a cotton product with a polyester lining, but we weren't really collecting the actual data of the various different components. So when it came to the fibre calculations for science-based targets and the impact of our business, we didn't have enough data, basically. So we had gone back to have a look at, okay, actually, how much polyester are we bringing in? How much of that is recycled? How much cotton are we bringing in? What's actually happening? So we were actually looking to identify that for our fibre mix. Fortunately, actually, that's going to, I think, start and pay off now that we've put that into our normal ways of working, is to actually start and break down. And actually, you need that really for your impact measurement as well. And then that also leads into, what are you going to do with your recyclability of the product? So how much of that is monomaterial, how much of that is mixed componentry, etc., which is also going to feed into your recyclability.
Is everything we've discussed, all the different elements of this, is this changing how New Look are designing and the products that you're making? And do you think this, if not, or if it is, do you think this will continue to have an impact on how?
So I think what's really interesting about the e-commodity. So I think what's really interesting about this, hopefully you can hear me because you look like you've frozen on my screen.
Yep.
Can you still hear me, Graham? Yeah.
Yep.
So I think what's really interesting about this, again, I talk about this convergence. So I think rather than confusing everybody, I think it's really important that actually we start to look at what a circular business model looks like and how that links in with EPR. Because a lot of things that you're going to be doing are actually going to feed into your EPR, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is measure what is the impact. So the answer to your question is, there's a lot of things that were happening in the business that are related to multifacets on this. a lot of which will lead into an improved EPR if we go for eco-modulation. For example, we've looked at our fibre mixes, making sure that we are gradually increasing the percentage of our recycled content, knowing where our fibres come from, some of which will be helpful for the recycling purposes, some of which helps for our impact purposes. I sat in a buying office discussion where they were looking at their forward planning a few weeks ago, and actually people are fairly well trained now to talk about their kind mix and what they're doing, etc. So it's a slow burn, but you get there and it starts to become part of the vocabulary in the business. But actually they were really underselling themselves, because actually a lot of eco-modulation is around, okay, how are you using information back about returns, about durability, to actually influence what you're doing for the product going forward. And I think that's also something that's really important. So we start to talk about durability. The conversation, yes, it's great that France has a durability measure. The conversation about durability measure in the UK is something that's still, in the melting pot, basically, as to how best we're going to measure that. But I'd certainly, learning from your returns, making sure that you're reacting if customers are not happy with the performance of a product, basically continual improvement to actually make sure that you are making sure that your product is durable and the longevity is there. Obviously, with a fashion business, you've got some product which lends itself beautifully to that, and if the trend is for a less durable product, then obviously that's a bigger challenge. And I think those are things that as an industry we've still got to face into. But the answer to your question is yes, it is having quite subtle and in some cases quite marked impacts. We're also training people so that they understand the decisions that they're taking. And actually a lot of the industry bodies that I talked about, whether that be the CFIN or whether that be Textiles 2030 and WRAP, they are offering ways in which you can actually bring your designers, your buying teams, etc., up to speed on good decisions when it comes to durability and recyclability of product. So I think it is having it's definitely having an effect on the way in which we look at our product.
Thank you, Sue. Circling back for a second, Amy, you did mention them. I want to cover a couple of other things that our audience should know as part of this EPR discussion. And we mentioned PROs, lots of acronyms, producer responsibility organizations. Amy, could you tell us a little more about these?
Yeah, absolutely. Second acronym of the day of the webinar. So PROs or pros, which I'm going to refer them to, they're entities that help companies meet their EPR obligations. Essentially, PROs, they act as intermediaries, managing the collection, recycling, or disposal of products on behalf of producers. For example, in the textile sector, a pro might organize the logistics and systems needed to collect old clothing or textiles, ensuring they're properly recycled or disposed of. Companies that are part of an EPR scheme can become members of a PRO. And then that PRO, which handles these tasks on the producer's behalf, which really reduces the administrative burden on individual brands and retailers too.
Thank you, Amy. I wanted to talk a little bit about as well. I was investigating the rules in France, and which we've touched on there, eco-modulation, and there are different sort of elements. One of them being durability, which Sue mentioned, another being recyclability, which Sue also mentioned. But in preparation for this webinar, we discussed how in some ways when designing for recyclability and designing for durability, they could almost be in contrast with each other. And it's difficult to be durable and recyclable, or even the other way around. So how, do you have any kind of guidance on this? It is an incentive, but is there any advice on sort of what approach to take, I guess? Amy, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so designing for durability and recyclability is challenging due to the need to balance performance, aesthetics, and environmental impact. Mixed materials complicate recycling as not all fibers can be processed together. However, as recycling technologies advance, these challenges are diminishing. Innovations enable the recycling of previously non-recyclable materials, allowing designers to create durable products that are easier to recycle. And we've got 3 different types of textile recycling currently. We've got mechanical, chemical, and thermal. Mechanical is probably the most well-established, and is very common for cotton recycling, and the process is where a cotton t-shirt, for example, will be shredded, which in turn will reduce the fiber lengths, and then it can be recycled back into new cotton material. The issue that we're currently facing with mechanical recycling is that the fibers lose their strength through that shredding process, and usually we'll need to incorporate virgin materials just to ensure that that product still has that durability and longevity when it's made back into a new textile. Then we've got chemical, where synthetic polymers are broken down, as well as cellulosic polymers as well, and that's via chemical treatments like solvents, enzymes, or acids. So the pros of chemical recycling is that actually the output, it's high quality. The dyes that are in the materials are removed through the chemical recycling process, and it's also closed loop. However, it's currently at a very high cost and high energy use, and it means managing chemicals as well. And lastly, we have thermal recycling. So this is where synthetics are melted after mechanical shredding, like polyester, for example. And the positives on thermal recycling is that there's less chemicals being used. The equipment is much simpler, so it could be more scalable than chemical recycling. And as well as less chemicals, it's also lower in energy use. However, the fiber quality doesn't compare to chemicals. The fiber quality is not as strong, and you can only use thermal recycling for textiles that are thermoplastics, so PET, PP, nylon, and also the dyes can't be removed. So chemical is really best for high quality output of mixed materials, and then thermo is best for mono materials. But the great thing about EPR is that when these fees come in, it could be used to invest in these different types of technologies and help them become scalable so that we can make old textiles back into new.
Excellent, thank you, Amy. Sue, what's your opinion on this sort of, maybe if we're talking about eco-modulation, sort of where to focus your energy, or what, is there...
Yeah. So my first opening statement really was actually, fair approach on EPR, but also definitely advocating for the revenues that are raised through EPR to help support the investment that's going to be required to create an ecosystem to deal with textile waste, particularly I'm going to think about on our own shores in the first place. So New Look, along with other brands, were part of the UKFT CFIN piece looking at, for example, the auto-sortation of textile products. It's quite an interesting project. It's trying to bring to the UK, or it will be bringing to the UK, new technologies basically to help us sort the non-rewearable textiles and to start and generate a way in which we can then separate the textiles for use in the ways in which Amy has just outlined. So from our perspective, it is really a case of, EPR, if used in the right way, could really generate something which will allow us to further that circular economy. It could attract different industries. However, what I would say is one of the other conversations that we're having in the industry at the moment, and having visited a number of recyclers just recently, there is a real struggle, and what we need to be doing is creating a realistic roadmap on this. So what should we be doing right now? What can happen in 5 years? What will happen in 10 years, basically, and give everybody on this call a really clear roadmap to the best activities that can be conducted at the moment, basically. So from our perspective, I think having a finger in a lot of those guys, basically, to understand the best way. Clearly, trying to get product to last as long as possible and be reworn, etc., is the right way, basically. But actually, ultimately, all of that product, whether it takes 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years down the line, is going to end up in as waste, basically. So having to find ways to deal with that is something that we need to accelerate as a programme.
Thank you, Sue. So there's no denying, I think anyone who's sat through these 37 minutes will know that this sounds quite complicated, and there may be a lot of admin that comes with it. But whose job is it, or whose job should it be? And what should brands and retailers, looking around the office thinking, whose responsibility is this? How can they deal with it? Amy, what advice do you have?
Yeah, so EPR can definitely feel overwhelming with all the reporting and administrative tasks. We've already got it for packaging, batteries. Now it's extending to textiles and even more waste streams or fractions. We'll have EPR in the future too. But the good news is that brands and retailers don't have to handle it all on their own. The responsibility, it will usually often fall on the sustainability, compliance, or supply chain teams within a company. So what can brands do? Well, they can partner with companies like us, like Reconomy. We've been supporting clients with EPR legislation since 1997 and can help navigate the complexities, streamline the processes, and also ensure businesses are compliant. So by working together, we can help producers take care of all the heavy lifting, allowing brands to focus on what they do best while staying on the right side of legislation.
Amy, so what you're beginning to deal with this. I'm sure there were some interesting conversations in your office. What advice do you have? Where to start, how to handle a new job, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because actually, if I think about the way in which packaging waste started, it started within my team, with the technologists and the sustainability.
I think we may have lost you again, Sue. Okay. Well, whilst we wait and see
the business, and trying to making sure that the wider teams are aware. Sorry, did you lose me there? Am I back?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I think we lost you.
So I think I don't know where you lost me, but shall I start from the beginning?
Yes,
I think the point I was making was that actually, whilst my team were very much as technologists, etc., they started on the packaging piece, and then it became a labeling and packaging piece that we were following it through. Actually, I think my advice to most people is really involve the wider players in the business. It is a tax, and therefore your tax teams will be interested in what may be coming down the pipeline. Your finance teams will definitely be involved in terms of forward budgeting, etc. Your procurement and your buying teams will be involved in terms of how can potential costs be mitigated. And I would look for synergies with existing roadmaps on your technology platforms, to make sure that as they're building new technology, and there's a lot happening on technology platforms at the moment, to make sure that actually the way in which the data is collected and the way in which the unique identifiers, the attributes that you're using in the business, how they might need to be challenged and changed going forward. So I would create yourself a little steering group, basically, that's looking at your EPRs. I agree with Amy. Actually, we use third parties as well to help us. In very often not so much the collection of the data, but to validate the data, and also to actually make sure that we can navigate the complexities of actually paying the bills in the countries that and in the countries that we're operating in, and also the third parties. If you're working with third party platforms, or if you're working with other retailers of which you're part of their ecosystem, start and talk to them quite quickly about what kind of data they're going to require, and what format, because I think a lot of this is around metrics as well. So you might be collecting data, but actually the format that they require it in, or the metrics that they're using, etc. The sooner you know about that, the quicker you can change the way you're collecting your data.
So you mentioned obviously EPR is essentially a tax. So there will be fees for businesses. Where will this money come from? Will it impact margins? Will it be passed on to the consumer? Will it have an impact on the supply chain? A tricky question, but I'm going to ask you, Sue.
Well, it's the killer question, isn't it? And actually asking that on the day of the budget, basically, where cost of running a business is actually, going up every day. But the answer is all of the above. I think it's going to be a difficult one to pass up the value chain, because from that point of view, you then could impact the quality of the product that's coming in if people start to cut corners from that perspective. However, you can affect the way in which the goods are delivered, and that can also have an effect on mitigating the costs. So I think you can involve your wider value chain in mitigating potential taxes when you're actually looking at your forward product costs. So it will come into cost of goods ultimately when you place the product on the market. And again, then it is a case of, yes, I do think some of this will be passed on to the consumer, because ultimately what we're doing is we're paying for what's going to happen once the consumer gets it into their home. But again, it's from my perspective also, looking and being part of the Sandbox project, which was run by QSA and now a company called, they've set up a company called Weft that are working on this going forward. We were together with lots of other retailers providing data to help inform on this piece of work. I think it's really key that actually I like the idea that there's things I can do to make sure that if the tax is coming our way, that actually we can use our responsible business practices to actually mitigate some of those costs. So in that programme, for example, we could start and look at products where the recycling content, the ability to recycle the product, the way in which we were producing the product, all could have a potential impact on reducing the ultimate taxes. I know I keep saying this, Graham, but it's really important to me that I do stress that actually the fairness of this programme is also really important. So if it's a level playing field and everybody is being applied in the same and a fair way, then fair enough. If there are people who are able to exploit loopholes based on the de minimis on import, etc., that's something which needs to be sorted out in the country, basically.
Excellent viewpoints as always, Sue. Amy, what's your view on this? Where is, to put it bluntly, where is the money going to come from?
Yeah, well, thank you, Sue. I think Sue really covered this topic, but just to reiterate some points, it's going to add to operational costs, EPR, and brands are going to need to decide how to manage this. And the money to cover these fees could come from several areas. It might result in reduced margins. It may impact the supply chain, or in some cases, these costs could be passed on to consumers through slightly higher prices. And what's key is for businesses just to plan strategically. Investing in more sustainable practices now could reduce long-term costs and also strengthen brand loyalty and helping to balance out these new expenses. For example, using more durable material means fewer returns or replacements, while designing for recyclability can lower EPR fees over time. It also encourages more efficient use of resources, which could cut production costs. And as for brand loyalty, consumers are increasingly drawn to companies that prioritize sustainability. When brands show that they care about the environment, they build trust and stand up for the competition. And this can lead to stronger customer relationships, repeat business, and a positive reputation, ultimately boosting brands' long-term success.
Thank you, Amy. Now I'm going to go to a couple of questions from our audience. So if you haven't sent yours in, please do. Somebody has asked, they call themselves a purely UK company, and they've asked where should they focus now? Should it be data collection and sorting that side of things out? Or is it more kind of strategy and future proofing and a little less kind of on the ground work, I guess? They've also added a point which I think is really interesting. How do you get senior leaders interested and involved when they believe the threat of EPR in the UK feels quite small? I think you would both agree that the threat is not small. It's coming, but I'm not going to put words into your mouth. Sue, why don't we start with you? What do you think a UK business should be doing now, and how do you get buy-in from senior leaders?
I think I would be taking advice as a UK company on how I link my product data to my sales data for reporting purposes. You could use the packaging information that we currently have to give you some kind of forward insight into how you might need to report on what you're placing on the market. I think the one thing I would also add is that when this conversation started a little while ago, everybody just said, well, should we just pay the tax and be done with it, basically? And I think people were quoting, a penny a garment or whatever it might be, and were sort of running some calculations on that. I think the reality is actually that, the taxes could be quite considerably higher than that, and therefore starting to look at how you might want to mitigate that, using Europe as a first starting point, but also getting involved with the industry bodies so that you are well informed on this. I'm sure Amy will give you some other ideas on this as well from a commercial point of view. But if you're looking for information, my advice would be go to your industry bodies, basically the BRC, the BFC, the UKFT as a starting point, the Textiles 2030 programme, who can also start and help, how you might want to get prepared for this.
Great. Just in case, that's the UK Fashion and Textile Trust, the British Fashion Council, and the British Retail Consortium. Lots of acronyms. I always try and make sure we say them. Amy, what's your view on that question? That two-part question. What should UK businesses be focusing on, and how do you get buy-in from senior leaders?
Sorry, could you just repeat the second half of the question, Graham, please?
Yeah. So the audience member has said, senior leaders feel the threat of EPR is quite small currently. We don't know what it is. It's not finalized. How do you persuade them that shouldn't be the case?
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. To second what Sue said, I think data preparation is key. Understanding sales data as well as product information is going to help everyone get ahead of the legislation in preparation for when it does come to the UK. Although it might seem a ways away, it's better to, if you fail to plan, what's the old expression? But I think advocating for harmonization is going to be a really strong role that British brands and producers can play. Harmonization is going to be key in the EU, and then having a similar system in the UK and globally is only going to help make textile EPR legislation less of an administrative burden for producers. And also the note of being proactive, what's really great and what we're seeing and what we're supporting a lot of our retail clients with is voluntary take back. It's helping consumers know where they can start sending their unwanted textiles and providing them with the ability to bring clothes in store, well, not just clothes, all textiles in store and donate them for either reuse or recycling with the support of a third party like us, for example. Not only does it help to drive footfall in store, and what we're noticing is a lot of fashion brands are providing vouchers in exchange for textiles being brought in store. But yeah, I think the most important thing is it helps consumers do the right thing and know where to go when they have old textiles that they no longer need.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a nice question, or I think it's interesting. Someone's sort of taken it from an educational point of view, or people, entering the industry. I guess this is an opportunity. There's new skills related to this, or new knowledge, or if you want to be a designer, you almost need to learn to be a designer that takes these things into account. Sue, do you have any advice around that? Are there skills gaps that that maybe not just related to EPR, but just kind of this whole topic in general that you think you would love the stars of the future to kind of come with knowledge of?
I think hopefully you can hear me. I think the challenge we have here is a lot of the academic institutions are at the table, and we know that students are getting some really great training on what needs to happen. I think then it's when they come into the commercial environment, being able to apply that basically, I think is, it needs a combination of taking some new thinking on this and mixing it in with the existing environments basically. But yes, I would advocate for anyone coming out of any of the colleges and certainly the sustainability skills gaps that we have basically, to help train people in new ways of thinking as far as it's concerned. I think the biggest challenge that I have at the moment is that we have a bit of a gap into our value chain. So sometimes things that are really apparent to us as retailers and that we think we're transferring great knowledge into our value chain, actually quite often we have to be better at explaining why we need certain information in certain ways, and what we're actually doing with that information. I think also from the point of view of new designs and new fabrications, I think I'm also really mindful that where we're buying into smaller brands, so New Look sell quite a number of small brands as a platform basically. It's also making sure that I'm very fortunate. I've got a reasonable sized team of well-informed people. We're part of a lot of the conversations in the UK. I'm really mindful that actually smaller brands, maybe they don't have the same exposure to what's happening, and I actually think, Graham, that's why people like Drapers, etc. This is a great way of making sure that people are well informed on what's coming down the pipeline and where best to get the information that they need. And I think those of us that are slightly better informed, basically, it's really important that we're sharing that knowledge as well, to make sure that that people are prepared for this.
Thank you, Sue. There's a question from the audience that I actually hadn't thought of. How do EPR fees apply for returns? Is tax adjusted? Do you just pay for what you make? Do you pay for what you sell? Do you pay how does that work? Does anybody want to take that?
Well, you know what? I'm going to dodge that question because I don't think people have got the answers to it.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know how returns. It's an excellent question, and actually, a big part of our business is returns management for our clients, and we don't know how returns will be taken into account when it comes to EPR fees. Right now, the EPR fees are structured based on what's placed on the market for the first time. If a product's returned and it can be resold, then it's placed on the market for the second time. But how does that get accounted for? And it's a really interesting question, and it'll be interesting to see how that gets taken into account with the EU legislation.
Another case of we're not quite sure yet, but still something that we need to be considering. I was going to ask, obviously, today we've talked about EPR, but I just wanted to broaden this out a little bit and just ask, starting with Sue, what other challenges is really taking up your time at the moment in this space? Is there anything else that people should be, having their pipeline and be considering? There's a lot of other kind of slightly off-topic questions, but I just thought it might be from the audience, but I thought it might be quite nice if you could touch on any that maybe the audience can relate to.
Well, I mean, actually, to be honest with Graham, I'd probably need 3 weeks for that, to be honest. But I think some of the answers I would give you is obviously decarbonisation up the value chain, basically, and how that gets paid for and accelerated, and the partnerships up from that perspective. I think also the CMA challenges around how you balance what you want to say about your product against, fear of being accused of greenwashing. I think that's a big challenge, making sure that we have all the validations in place for that, and making sure we're getting that balance right. I'd hate to get caught out for some little word or something when actually there's a lot of effort going into it, and I think that's something which a lot of people are challenged with at the moment. So there's many other things which are topics of conversation. I think obviously the market at the moment, so it's a tough market at the moment, and I think balancing investment in sustainability against actually being able to survive as a business. I think that's important, that actually we do what's right for the business at the right time, and never go backwards is the mantra that we have within New Look, basically. So we published our report just on the 3rd of October. And that actually, the sustainability report's available on the newlook.com website, and it demonstrates actually how you've just got to be sensible. I think a lot of people want you to do overnight, but actually we've got to be sensible. The pace at which we move forward on all of this, basically, some of which it needs infrastructures around it to be able to really deliver what it is that we need to deliver. And I think that's also the big part of being in the collaborative space, basically. And something like EPR is something that allows that to be a collaboration rather than a pushing water uphill as a single brand, basically.
Thank you, Sue. Amy, we are running out of time, so I thought you could take this opportunity to share anything, any of the other key issues you're seeing across the industry with a lot of the brands and retailers that you work with, and just kind of, so your final remarks on today's conversation.
Thanks, Graham. There is so much legislation coming towards fashion brands and retailers. Besides EPR, there's about 15 to 16 other bits of legislation that are being developed in the EU. You've got digital product passports, eco-labeling, green claims directive. There's so much coming textile producers' ways. And there's a lot of uncertainty out there because a lot of this legislation is under development, and knowing what to do when it's an unknown. And I think to refer to a point that Sue made earlier, it's about collaborating internally and utilizing your teams and resources and getting them together to be strategic and prepare for this, but also utilize resources that you have externally too, and have with services like we have with our horizon scanning, which navigate the global legislative landscape around textiles EPR, and is a fantastic how-to guide so that producers of textiles can know what's happening when and how to stay ahead of it.
Excellent, thank you. Such an interesting conversation, and I think, as Sue said, we could have gone 3 more weeks, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Hopefully that is helpful to our audience. I think lots of interesting insight and advice shared. So thank you, Sue, and thank you, Amy, for your time and for your contribution. Thank you to our partner once again, Reconomy, and thank you to everyone watching. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you.